going to give you another perspective of what is space law and why law is important for the space sector. So, as you can see, the title of this workshop is Analyzing the Impact of Treaties on the Space Sector and Industry on a Large Scale. There's a few questions that we wanted to ask regarding how do we understand space law, what does this mean, actually, these treaties, or do we enforce such treaties, and actually are we equipped to be an actual legislator in outer space. But first being first, okay. I think that doesn't work, the remote. Oh, it's working now. Just a few preliminary notions for you to have a better understanding of the legal fundamentals applying to space. So we're talking about law in outer space. First thing first, don't forget that law is a language. There is no mathematics behind this. It's purely a language phenomenon. That means that if you speak Arabic, if you speak French, if you speak English, you're going to have the way the language expresses itself that's going to impact the way you formulate law. So that is something to take into account. On the other hand, the notion of space needs to be strictly defined. What are we talking about? Outer space is a very specific fraction of space. Because if you take, for instance, Saudi, the land is the national territory of Saudi. And the air up the kingdom belongs also to the kingdom, up to a certain limit. When we go above a limit of, let's say, 100 kilometers, which is the scientific consensus, we reach the barrier where we are theoretically in outer space. Legally speaking, there is no formal definition of outer space. That means that all the states in the world reserve the right to potentially claim a higher limit. So that's something very fundamental for you guys to understand that space law, primarily, we're going to see that later, apply to states and apply to everything that is above a certain limit of the national territories. That doesn't mean that space law does not apply in the state. That just means that the natural element of space law is really outer space as defined by a scientific consensus and not by a legal one. I know it looks kind of special, but that shows you how diplomacy and international law are deeply intricated. Okay, one very fundamental Roman quote, ubi societas, ubi ius. Does anyone in the audience know what does that mean? Okay, I see some people nodding. Okay, no suspense. Where there is a society, there is law. That's a very fundamental Roman law principle. If you have a human society everywhere, there's going to have some legal parameters happening. That also means that if there is no law, there is no society. That means that outer space, even if it's a hostile environment, if there is no permanent human settlement there, there is a law and a regulation that is still applicable. What does that imply is that law is a social phenomenon. So there is a mutual understanding between people. If we have a law, if we use a law within a society, it can be here on Earth or out there in outer space, that means because we need to understand each other. When we have a contract, we have our interests, and you have the other interest of the other person, but we need to find a common ground in order to work together, right? So that's why we're going to have law. That's the same for outer space. We are two nations. One nation is working with another one. They need understanding. So law is also a tool of trust. It conveys trust, and it's also indeed convey control. Governments, they're going to use the law in order to control the space sector. But the law will also be used by space stakeholders in order to trust themselves. They're like, okay, we want to partner up with you in order to do a space mission. We're going to use this regulation, and that's going to be a means for us to be understandable together and to trust each other. Some fundamental notions before we dive deeper in what is space treaties. First, the notion of law per se. Law is, as I said, a language that is enforced, generally enforced by a higher authority that the society acknowledges. For instance, in Saudi, you have the law of Saudi, and if you break the law, you're going to go to court, and the court is mandated by the government. That's the typical system, whatever political system you have, that always worked the same way. Then we have the notion, very important in outer space, of soft law. Because, and we will see that, because treaties are so high level and they are so difficult to modulate and to modify, we have another branch of law which is soft, meaning it's not, the opposite of soft is hard. That means that it's difficult to be enforced. That's just great principle. That's something that can be seen as compliance. The aim is not to punish or control. The aim is to incentivize. That's something that is very important because, as we're going to see, in the international law system, it's very difficult to put constraint. Why? And that's why you also have another brick of the fundamental knowledge that is sovereignty. International law is applicable to a very specific type of subject of law, which are states. And states have a particularity that they are sovereign. A sovereign has control over a population in a delimited territory. In order to have sovereignty, you need three parameters. You need people, you need government, and you need territory, like Saudi, like France, like the US. International law applies to states, not to private persons. That's something very important to understand. That's why treaties primarily aim at states and not at people. Then we saw the notion of enforcement, very important. If you want to have law applicable to people, you need to enforce it. And then, notion very important, authority. Authority is a little bit different of sovereignty. Authority is a middle ground between influence and control. Something very delicate to understand, but that's critical in the area of space. So these pictures basically show you what's going on in outer space. Earth on the central, of course. You have the moon. You have people, astronauts. You have launchers. You have quite a look-alike launchers, like planes that are a little bit higher than plane, but lower than typical launchers. You have satellites. You have small satellites. You have asteroids. So that's basically the ecosystem. All this ecosystem is regulated somewhat by law. So there is 5 big questions that we're going to try to see during this short presentation. Why do we have a space law? Why do we need to have a space law? So the first answer that we could have is this Roman maxim I was quoting earlier. Ubi societas, ubi ius. I mean, we have a society there, we have an economy running there, so we need rules. Where does it apply? As I told you, it primarily applies in outer space, but because we have space activities on Earth, it also applies here. Even if it looks weird to think that space law would apply on Earth, it applies on Earth. Then, what does it regulate? Basically, everything related to space, from launching to in-orbit activities. Who shall apply space law? Primarily, as I said to you, treaties are aiming at states. But as I said, states are sovereign, and as sovereign, they have people. And these people are under the influence, under the rule of the law of the states. That means that when you are, for instance, a Saudi citizen or French citizen, if you are a space actor, you're going to have to apply the law that the French government, the Saudi government enact in order for you to carry on your space activities. So that's some sort of like derivative from the treaties to you as a private person. And then when? When does the space law apply? Is that when we push the ignition buttons? Way before it applies, actually. When you have a space project, space law applies from day one when you are thinking about it. Because when you are, for instance, negotiating contracts, we already are thinking about, okay, we need authorization, we need to have frequency, we need to plan ahead. That's why space law is way more than only outer space regulation. So just, to put a little bit on a historical context, what happened during the very first exploration of outer space to nowadays with what we call new space? Legally speaking, we always say that the first space law is the regulation that we adopted, that the government of the world adopted to regulate frequencies. In 1865, the International Telecommunication Union adopted what we call the Constitution of the ITU. Basically, this is the very first piece of legislation regulating the use of spectrum. For instance, when you are using your mobile phone, of course, you are using spectrum because there is no wire, it's all wireless. That's the same for satellite. That's the same for everything which is wireless. Even this remote control, there are some ITU regulation on it because you are using spectrum. So that's the very first piece of legal text, international law, that is applicable potentially to space activities. Then we jump ahead almost a century. We had First World War, Second World War, and Second World War during, the German and then the American took this technology. We started to experiment missile, and then we started with Sputnik and all the Soviet/US race that ended up to go to the moon, of course. So during this period, that's when all the main treaties has been enacted. Why? Back in these days, of course, we were just out of World War II. We wanted to have a more peaceful world, indeed. We also had the rise of United Nations. So we had a way to enact international law applicable to all the governments of the world. So what happened is that in order to avoid World War III in outer space, and with the impulsion of even of the US and USSR, the government tried to work and to pass first some resolution and then some real treaties in order to put real foundation of space law. The first one being peaceful use of outer space, because it was absolutely out of the question that World War III would happen in outer space. So that's something very contextual. So that also shows you that in these days, between 1950 and 1980, all the major treaties have been adopted during these 30 years of Cold War because they absolutely wanted to avoid a new conflict. That was good back in the days. Now we will see that in 2022, situation evolved quite a lot. So between 1991 and 2010, that's what we call, of course, the post-Cold War period. Regarding the industry, what we noticed is that we switched from a very state-owned and run space industry to a more privatized. Maybe you guys know, if you use some satellite phone, maybe you know the company Intelsat. Intelsat used to be an international organization that was privatized because, it was no longer needed to have a government-run space industry. We just wanted the commercial sector to take over. So that's what happened during these years. And then, way later, in 2010, some guys started to have some idea. Some guys, maybe you guys know Elon Musk, started to come with a crazy dreams of maybe having some reusable rockets, whatever. And that's when we started to see some, funds, some ventures, private ventures, willing to send something in outer space. That's what we call new space, in opposite to legacy space, like the big one, like Lockheed Martin, Airbus, all these big guys that are here since the Cold War. These new guys coming up, they are startup system oriented. So they want flexibility. They are less obsessed with 100%, let's say, reliability of the component. They want to do the mission first. So that's a major switch in how this industry is working. That leads to 2022. What do we have right now in 2022? We have national missions like Artemis, international cooperation, which is also Artemis. We have new space, which with companies like SpaceX, but also tiny companies, small SMEs jumping into this. We have Ukrainian crisis, some nation that used to be not really into the space sector now jumping in massively. We have, small countries like Luxembourg now having some space regulation. So the world is really changing, and the space industry is really moving very, very fastly and dramatically. But of course, the core treaties, they have not been modified. Because in order to modify a treaty, because don't forget that, all states are sovereign. That means that when they are gathering around the table, there's nobody higher than the other one, not even the chairman or the chairwoman of the meeting. All the states, it's one voice. So if you want to modify a treaty, everybody needs to be okay with that. Otherwise, we don't modify it. So you can imagine, back in the Cold War, it was a very small club of states going to outer space, so it was not really a big deal if USSR and US was okay. Now, that's way more complicated. So just to show you a little bit, these famous space treaties. So the very most important one, the Bible of the space treaties, the Space Constitution, I would say, is the Space Treaty 1967. That all the core principle has been laid out in this piece of legal document. Very important instrument. vastly adopted by all the nations in the world and vastly applied. Then, as you can see on the little square, this is what we call some sort of sister treaty or application treaty. They are basically, this type of treaty has been scheduled by the Outer Space Treaty, and they are detailing some provision. They are putting in some sort of detail on how to apply this big principle. The very important one, of course, is the Liability Convention, because you know that space activities are per se very, very, very hazardous and dangerous. So if you screw up something, somebody needs to be liable for that. And as I mentioned before, that's why it's very important for you to keep that in mind. States are sovereign. So they are not really obliged to apply international law if they don't want. So that's why it's very important to have a very clear and easy to apply liability system. Then you have the Registration Convention. Registration Convention is basically a big file where if you're a state, you say, okay, I'm going to launch a satellite, and you write it down. So everybody on the world knows what you are launching to. Then you have the Rescue Agreement. Rescue Agreement is basically providing core protection for astronauts. Remember that 1968, full Cold War. So if a Soviet cosmonaut lands into the United States, that can be a tricky part. So the idea was like, if there is any problem in outer space, regardless of the flag you have on your shoulder, you need to be rescued. That's pretty much the same rules in IC. But there, it was very critical to avoid any violence or any distress signal to be seen as war. It's really like if there is an astronaut or a cosmonaut in danger, you have to make everything possible to recuperate the person. And then last one. Why I put it on last? Because it's, as you see the date. Date is very important, 1984. We are close to the end of Cold War. And this Moon Agreement had an idea of providing some sort of peaceful and sustainable way to extract and to live on other planets, the first one being the Moon. It was very much ahead of its time, and because I said, again, it was 1984, the major power back in the days, especially Russia and US, didn't show any interest on this. So basically, just a few countries signed it. So the Moon Agreement is pretty much a dead agreement. You have some ideas in there, some countries signed it, but that doesn't mean much for the Space Treaty core of principles. So as you can see, the big treaty, again, 1967, Outer Space Treaty, the foundational instrument. Then application treaties. Another one, if you go below the pyramid, the hierarchy of norms, you have the regional agreement. For instance, European Space Agency, it's a regional treaty. If you go below that, you have national space law. France has a space law. United States has a space law. Luxembourg has a space law. Emirates, they have a space law. And then if you go below that, you have national regulation. This is documents that are generally adopted by administration. Like the CNES, for instance, they have some specific, for the French Space Agency, they have some specific decree that are enacted by the government that they can apply, that's very technical. So you can see, we start with the big principle with the space treaties, and then we go down by the scale of details. And on the other side, as you can see, from the top to the bottom, we have what I call about soft law. This core of rules that are not really mandatory, but that here to help you navigate within this legal system. Something very important, because soft law help states also to think about, okay, what should I enact? What is important for me to regulate or not? So that's part of a debate. So that's why it's very important in the space industry that stakeholders, whatever they are, they can be space operators, they can be universities, they always discuss with government and agency in order to find the best solution to regulate the sector. Okay. Okay, perfect. The main principles. So sorry for, I think it's quite tiny, but I hope you can read it. So this main principle, they are still actual. They are in all the treaties. The very first one, very important, and we're going to see why it's very important, that's non-appropriation principle. That means that, okay, all the states are sovereign. So the land where they are, you can appropriate it. If you have, for instance, let's say, a UK citizen or a German citizen, you have a piece of land, you have a piece of paper granted by the government telling you, okay, we acknowledge that you own this place. That means, in order to give you this title of property, the government before that have to be sovereign on its land. Non-appropriation principles state that if you're on the moon, for instance, so sorry for our American fellow here, the fact that American put a flag on the moon doesn't mean that the moon is American. Because, yeah, sorry. Actually, that's just a symbolic action. Because the United States signed the treaty, so they said, disclaimer, we're not sovereign in any part of outer space where we are. The other very important freedom that has been granted by this treaty is that every state, and I repeat, every state, has a right to explore, to access first and to explore outer space. That's very important. That shows that the entire United Nations acknowledge that any state, any legitimate and sovereign state, can claim access to go to outer space. Again, not directly a private person. We're going to show that why later. Also, there is a very big, important freedom of exploration. You can go to outer space to do scientific missions. That's something you can do. And the corollary is the next block, which is the peaceful use of outer space. Remember, Outer Space Treaty was enacted and adopted during Cold War. It's okay to send military as long as they are doing scientific exploration, not weaponization. We're going to see the details between the two concepts later. So, freedoms, so basically, until now, basic principle. You can access outer space, you can investigate scientifically outer space, but you can't appropriate it. Also, astronauts, and that's a very important legal concept, astronauts are not seen as citizens. They are qualified as envoy of mankind. That means that regardless the patch that they have on their shoulder, if they are in distress, in danger, they need to be rescued by anyone present. And then, because any government that signed the treaty has the freedom and the liberty to access outer space, there is, of course, when you have a freedom, a liberty, you have responsibility. And because the government has this liberty to go in outer space, they are liable for their non-governmental entity. That's why, when I was telling you that your government has the right to go to outer space, but not you directly, you have the right to go to outer space because your government is giving you an authorization as per this treaty. So you see how the treaty is working. You are not the direct subject of the treaty, you are the direct subject of the treaty because your government wants to. That's something very, very different. Then we talk about this, the principle of liability. We're going to see that later. Principle of registration. We need to keep track about what it's sending in outer space. And then principle of jurisdiction and control. The government must control its non-governmental entity. And, of course, last but not least, very important right now because you know that there is a big debris crisis in outer space, environmental protection. So that's in a nutshell all that the treaties in the 60s as scheduled for space law regulation. So, we're not going to read that just for you to illustrate how it's work and how the big words has been enshrined into the space treaties. But as you can see, this one, Article 1, put the freedom in it. You can go there, but you have responsibility. Again, this one is also regarding the envoy of mankind. You are an astronaut, you are a citizen of your country, but you are also, when you are in outer space, you have a special status because you are in such a very dangerous area. Just a little anecdote that can be interesting for you. When Blue Shepard, you know, the Jeff Bezos Ventures, they wanted to send astronauts just, you know, for a very brief period of time in outer space. Maybe you heard about it, but NASA and FAA said, okay, they are not astronauts. That's also a question of insurance. Because, I mean, if you say that they are envoy of mankind, okay, so Blue Origin doesn't have any liability on this. Everybody needs to help them. If you say they are not envoys of mankind, that means they are not astronauts, so they have to be insured. You have all the civil aviation rule apply, and no longer the space one. So that's a little anecdote that shows you how it's critical on this. Liability Convention, long story short about liability. The international legal system is very clear on this. Everything that's happened on the surface of Earth, let's say, for instance, you launch a satellite. The satellite, unfortunately, crashes in Europe, in Africa, in the United States, 100% liable, even if it's not a fault. Let's say, for instance, the United States launched a satellite, the satellite falls on Spain, the United States government will be liable for any damages, even if it's not a fault. Even if it's not intentional, they have to pay for damages. In outer space, that's the other way around. If there is any damages in outer space, there's no liability because that's so hazardous in any case, except if it's gross negligence or if it's a huge fault. Like, for instance, you decide to, you say, okay, my satellite is going to crash into this other one. I don't care, let it be. And that's a gross negligence. So that's basically, long story short, the liability system applicable in outer space. Okay, this remote control. Oh, just a few words about the Moon Treaty. As you can see, as you can read on the table, the Moon Treaty is really dealing about the fact that if you want to, you can use natural resources in the Moon, but you have to do it in a very sustainable way, in a very specific legal context that has never been defined. As I said, the Moon Agreement is a little bit on the side because never been signed or ratified by major countries. So it's a little bit like on the side, a little bit randomized, but that's the way it is. You know, the problem of space treaties is that even if they have been adopted at the United Nations by the large majority of the committees, then they have to be ratified and signed. And so if you have a country, a treaty that has been largely ratified but not signed, basically your treaty is worth nothing. So that's why a life of a treaty, going from the paper to the reality, is a very, very long process. So that's why right now the Outer Space Treaty is really the ultimate reference for space activities regulation. What are the challenges right now regarding space regulation? As I was mentioning earlier, our treaties are getting old. They are from the Cold War era. And we are no longer, maybe for now, we are no longer in a Cold War era, at least for now. And we have new realities. I was mentioning these new startups coming up, new space. They are not. They don't work the same way as former, like big national industry. They are more quicker. They go international. They want to export. So they have a different way of working. Even in outer space, I'm talking about in-orbit servicing, which is absolutely not in question back in the 60s. So the problem we are facing right now, we have these treaties that are a reality, but they are not capturing the reality of 2022. And the problem is, because of this rule in the United Nations that are based on the sovereignty principle, we can't, unless having a very long and difficult process. It's very difficult to modify them because we need to have a consensus. So that's why right now we are in a big situation of block. So that's why you saw, maybe you heard about it recently, about the Artemis Accord. The United States trying to also influence the understanding of space law in order to put some debate on the table. The first one being, of course, space resources. We can see that later. So I was mentioning legacy space and new space, change in actors. Also, we're talking about, and that's why I'm coming back to Artemis. Okay, in the law, you have the law, the statutes, the constitution, the treaties, and you have all that is between private person, a private entity, the contract. A treaty, per se, it's a contract between states, between sovereign players. Right now, what we see in space and in the space legal domain is that the treaties and the international conventions are more and more marginalized. Now that really is the contract. And Artemis Accord, they are basically a contract passed by the United States and other stakeholders. That shows how the treaties, even if they shaped the regulation of outer space, but they are now being marginalized because they are too complicated to maneuver, too complicated to update. So that's why we are going to this contract period. Also, I was mentioning that space debris, there is nothing about space debris, of course, back in the 60s. The technology was really like very primitive compared to what we have right now. So the goal was really to send something that could actually work for a few minutes in orbit. So we didn't really care about that if exploding. We don't really care about this. But then, of course, now we have satellite, we have constellation, we have mega constellation. So if we have little debris floating at a few thousand kilometers per hour, that can be like a bullet. So that's something you want to avoid. As I was mentioning, mega constellation, also it's a huge problem. You have companies right now, I will not quote the name, but I think you heard about them. They are like, okay, we want to launch 7,500 satellites. We want to launch 100,000 satellites. Wow. How do we regulate that? That's complicated because, as we saw before, the international space law is saying, you're the states, you regulate your own part. The problem is when you send a satellite in orbit, well, it's no longer the state. I mean, everybody is there. So how do we regulate this cohabitation between satellites from different nationalities? That's something that is not really enforced in law right now. That's called space traffic management. That's something that is done by states, I mean, on a very beta version, but that's not something really international for now. Last but not least, weaponization and militarization. Sometimes I hear in conferences that you can't have military people in outer space. That ain't true. You can have military. The problem is, or not the problem is, you can't have weapons. And now, right now, we are facing a few problems, because what is a weapon? That has never been defined by any treaties. The problem we have right now, you have some satellites that can become a weapon by destination, if they are like, you know, the propulsion is changed and they stack into another satellites. Or you can also have now new ideas of protecting satellites against cybersecurity attacks. And so the device that we attach to the satellite to protect it, is that a weapon or not? That's a big question, and still unsolved. So this slide is just to show you the very, like, if you go on the top-down hierarchy, you have the space treaties, you have the regional agreements, and then you have the national space laws. As you know, not all the countries on Earth have space law. France, until 2008, didn't have any space law, and that worked anyway. So it's not mandatory to have a space law, but most of the jurisdictions right now, they are thinking about having one. Saudi is actually working on the draft of space law. And what is the goal of a space law is basically to put the understanding of the nation and to regulate the space actors. So the plan that you see on the board is the plan of the French space law, and it's 3 big pillars. First, of course, the authorization regime. Remember the big treaties? They said you can access outer space, but you need to regulate, you need to authorize people. Okay, let's do it, and we do it on the national level. Second, responsibility. You are liable for the action of you and your non-governmental entities. Okay, let's regulate also the liability. And then, that's something a little bit different, adapting also of the industry you have. France used to have still has a big impact on Earth observation segments, so we have a few provisions regarding intellectual property on space images. So that's depend of all of the nation, you know, agenda regarding the space. Take, for instance, another state. If you take Luxembourg, for instance, Luxembourg, they are strong. They are still strong in with SES on satellite communication, and now they are experiencing and investigating a new field, which are space resources. And of course, they are not a large state. They don't have a spaceport, whatever, but they enacted a law. And that was a great tool, because by enacting this law, and basically what the law is saying is that if you find a resource in outer space, you can appropriate it. So you can imagine the problem that we're having with the space treaties, because the space treaty, remember, says you can't appropriate outer space. Well, Luxembourg is a sovereign state, so it's complicated to go against it. And the United States, 2017, they did the same. But the United States were let's say, less polemic. What they did was like, if you find a space resources, you can sell it, you can make commerce with it, but hey, disclaimer, no sovereignty claim. So you can feel the different type of diplomacy and different type of what you want to do. So it depends on your agenda, if what your country wants to achieve. So that's why right now, Saudi is working on this national space law. That's also show the willingness of the government to investigate in this field. So that's why it's very important to have national space law. Because, of course, space treaties are very important, but as you saw, they are very old now, and it's difficult to modify them. So if you want to have something updated, you have to adopt a bottom-up logic. Okay, that's the end of what I wanted to say to you. Maybe now we can go to the question section. I hope it was not too technical. I wanted to have something very broad, because as you can see, it's a very complex and large field. Okay, if you have any question, let me know. The mic is coming to you.
Hi, if a country has an issue with another country regarding space law, one has law in place, one doesn't, does the one with law in place automatically get their way?
That's a great question you're asking. No, because actually the space law, the national space law, will not apply to a government. National space law, they apply to entity within the government, meaning private persons, space companies, space agency, etc. But the government per se is bound by the treaty it signed. So if you have a problem with another government, you are a government, you have a problem with another one concerning space law, you're going to apply, for instance, if there is an accident, you're going to apply the Liability Convention internationally. So you're going to go, there are some dispute resolution mechanisms, very complicated. For instance, there was one problem back in the days, during the Cold War, one Soviet satellite crashed in Canada. And this satellite was nuclear powered. So you can imagine a little mess that it created in North Canada. And so what happened is that Canada said, okay, Soviet, we have your satellites in our field. What are we going to do? And so what happened is that there was discussion government to government. And basically the agreement was like, okay, Soviet Union will just give you some money to clean that up, and you guys take care of it. Of course, Soviet Union didn't pay much, and the Americans took over the satellite. But that was Cold War, right? But just long story short, if you are government to government, national space law, they don't apply. But where you're right on this is that, of course, if your government has enacted laws on space law, that shows that you are more proactive and that you also have more control on your national actors. Because don't forget that when you are a government and when you are sponsoring a space actor, private space actor going to space, you are responsible for it. So that's why you need to be careful and you need to have in-state regulation system. Sir.
All right, thank you for your awesome presentation. It's very informative. My question is, with new space, what are the limitations of how far NGOs can go, and also nations as government entities?
Well, that's a great question you're asking, because yeah, we see that now with large company having a huge influence and huge impact on the market. Like, for instance, if you take the launchers, for instance, there is one that everybody knows here, a major company overtaking basically the private market. And NGOs, it's a little bit different, because it's really, for now, actually, the space industry is more like government, large company, and the new space. NGO is a little bit more marginalized, because you have always this sovereignty issue. But you're right on the fact that now, new space is a little bit moving this logic of top-down. During the Cold War, it was, of course, absolute necessity of government to validate everything because there was this Cold War issue, the strategic problem. Don't forget that a space rocket, if you put the nuclear stuff on top of it, it becomes a nuclear missile. So you have to be very, very, very careful about what you do, especially in the Cold War era. Right now, you have private company, so you want to stimulate the commerce also. So you don't want to overburden the sector. So government, they have to be quite balanced in their approach, not to kill the sector, not to overregulate it, but also they have to be responsible for it. So you're right on the fact that, especially with the rise of new space, a lot of small countries that were not thinking about having a space industry, now they can have a space industry. Even if it's just space data, at least it's part of the space industry. So they need to be way more careful. They can't say like, no, we don't want you to send anything in outer space because we don't know how to control you. They are like, okay, let's think about what we can do. Maybe we can launch from abroad. And now you have new spaceports coming up everywhere. So you see, access to space is also democratizing. So the space industry, which used to be a club, is now very widespreading everywhere. And that's a threat, but also an opportunity. So that's where states have to be very careful. And that's also why countries that not to have any space activities, like Saudi, are now thinking about it. And that's why they're also going to the legal action.
Thank you. So, forgive me if I missed it, but what about mineral extraction and who owns what with asteroids? Maybe we want to grab and mine an asteroid, and then also real estate, like on the moon. Like how are we going? Which laws can we appeal to keep from just having a big land grab as soon as multiple countries and companies start putting permanent facilities on the moon?
All right, so there's two questions in one here. The first one regarding resources per se, minerals, ore, water, regoliths on the moon. For a long period of time, it was purely taboo. And sci-fi, to be honest. I mean, nobody was like taking seriously that you're going to extract some water on the moon. What the hell was that? Now, situation has changed a lot. Especially, for instance, in the US, Colorado mines are really active on this. And now Luxembourg and other jurisdictions also. legally speaking, of course, you can appropriate. You can't say that you are sovereign. But some, and that's what happened in the US and Luxembourg, and now also with the Artemis Accord, the idea of using space resources is coming back. That doesn't mean that you are the sovereign of the moon or the sovereign of the asteroid. It just means that your legal system acknowledges that you can use it and potentially own it. But I agree with you. This is conflicting with the original vision of international space law. And that's an ongoing debate. That's a huge debate. Because if you look at, for instance, the Artemis Accord are the legal version, the legal aspect, the legal side of the Artemis mission. If you sign this, which is more like a MOU, you agree to some interpretation principle of the international space law. And within this MOU, which are the Artemis Accord, you have the idea of if you want to explore the moon, if you want to stay on the moon, you need to use the resources there, especially water. And that's where we go to your second part of your question. If you want to be more permanently on the moon, you need to have stable settlement. Problem is, who owns what? Or who is in charge of what? And the Artemis Accord have invented a very interesting notion of safety zone. Safety zone, they are not colonies. They are not dominion. They are just a zone where you are in charge of it. Let's say you're American or you're French or you're UK. This is your safety zone, you're in charge of it. You're in charge of maintaining it, maybe maintaining the public order. Maybe that reminds you something, you know, having a government, people, territory. It's not sovereignty, it's a safety zone. Recently, I don't know if you saw that, but the United States think that they would like to claim some safety zone, especially on the moon pole, because there is the water there. And China, of course, is claiming pretty much the same area. So that's going to be quite a problem, quite a legal problem, because China is not part of the Artemis Accord. So China doesn't know what is the safety zone, and they can say, what the hell is that? I mean, I'm just signatory of the Outer Space Treaty, so I want to go to the moon to do some scientific exploration, and I need to use the resources for scientific exploration. So why is there a safety zone run by the United States? That's going to be a huge dialogue on this. That's also why you have this race right now to push this mission as soon as they can in order to make precedent, like we see in case law. There is a similar situation if you see Antarctica. Antarctica, because it's very hostile environment, just some countries, including France, have claimed some part. It's not part of the French territory, kinda. It's kind of a safety zone. I mean that we are in charge of maintaining it, of protecting it, and of making some scientific exploration. But it's not part of the French territory. Again, kinda. So that is this gray area and this gray situation that we're going to have, especially on the moon. Because the problem is, even for a law, we saw that on the Moon Treaty. Moon Treaty 1984, way ahead of its time. Way ahead of its time. And especially at the end of the Cold War. So nobody really, I mean, outer space was less strategic than before. So if you can have the best treaty in the world. If nobody signed it, if nobody cares about it, that's not law, it's soft law. So that's why you need also to have people to apply it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting.
Thank you.
My question's related to the previous one.
Okay.
So, as your example before, treaties are signed by the countries. Mm-hmm. So, how can we make or convince the countries to sign these treaties? Is there a strategy or something? Because we know that without the treaties, as your example, there are going to be, problems over the moon. It's even if we have, as you said, a safety zone. So if I was digging there, looking for the water, but another country like China, they're not a part of the Artemis Treaty. So how can we deal with that? Because as we know the treaties are the solution, but how can we make the solutions here? So I don't know. This is the question every time I think about space law. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if there's a solution or not.
Well, thank you for the question, because that's when the lawyer called the diplomat, right? We're like, hey, dude, we have a problem. We have a beautiful treaty, but nobody want to sign it. Please, can you make some calls and see some people at night? That's the job of states. Some states, they want to push some ideas, so they craft some draft treaties and they go and see other states, etc. Maybe, you know what? Maybe one day the Artemis Accord will become an international treaty. We don't know. We don't know yet. Like if you take, for instance, the Artemis Accord per se, a few years ago, nobody would have thought that Italy and France would have signed it. We signed it, Italy signed it. So that shows that there is this work of some people say propaganda, some people say just convictions, some people say demonstration of ideas. That's also why it's very important to have forums. And right now in the space industry, you have a lot of forums everywhere, people discussing. For instance, right now, if you take the idea of the space debris, it's something very urgent, and everybody in the room is concerned by this. Because if it's a huge blockade out there, that's going to be a huge disaster for every country in the world. If you can't send a rocket safely, if you can't have satellites, every country in the world will have problems. So that's why for now, I don't know if you said that, but now the United States and some countries, France also recently, decided to ban any anti-satellite weapon test. That's a step that maybe that will lead to an international treaty banning this type of technology. We don't know. That's also why that space law is deeply connected with diplomacy. And that's also why the logic of top-down is maybe no longer valid. Maybe it's also important to have a bottom-up approach. We're talking about resources, we're talking about the moon. There is a lot right now of consultation worldwide about what do you think about regulation. Because if you put yourself in the head of a government, whatever it is, the government maybe has some interest in outer space, but the government is like, wait, I want first to attract capital. I want to attract people to work in my space industry. If I have a way too complex legal regime, nobody will come to my country. Everybody will go in another country. So we need coordination. But on the other hand, some countries, they are like, I don't want to regulate anything. I want to be some sort of like Vegas of outer space. So everybody can come and I attract capitals and I make projects. So it's always a balance. So that's why you have international, you have regional thinking, you have international conferences. But the idea, could be to go to new treaties. Personally, I think, especially right now with the uncertainty and the new space, that's going to be very difficult to have new treaties. But international agreements or regional agreements, that's something that can be achieved definitely, especially for debris or something that is really, really consensual within the industry. Yeah. So.
Hi, sir. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you so much.
I have some sort of a personal question. I'm a legal professional, so I'm just asking about like your space advocate. Who's your clients and what do you do actually on a daily basis? That's it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for this advertisement moment. Well, it depends. My clients, they are mostly new space actors and some legacy players. New space actors, they come at me for general advising and sometimes also for regulatory, which means launch authorization, frequency regulation. Legacy actors, they're more coming for consulting questions, like very specific point of space law or foreign forward thinking, like space resources, etc. And I also advise governments or foreign entity, especially when they want, for instance, to purchase French or European material. They come at me because they want a French-speaking lawyers to make an intermediary. So that's basically it. But you're right on the fact that new space has both traditional corporate law, tax law, IP, but they also have all the regulatory issue, especially because all the traditional legal system for launch authorization, spectrum regulation, they are designed for major companies, not for startups. So now you see ITU, all these big international bodies, they are trying to adapt. But that's an ongoing partnership between the stakeholders in order to make the outer space more accessible. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question.
Hi, there's already quite a few companies doing space tourism. Will it get to a point where there can't be any more with travel companies? There's so many organizations that have planes. But is there a limit to how many organizations can work in space?
That's a good question. For me, right now, at this moment of time, the only limit is the market. I mean, now, especially in the new space segment, you see a lot of initiatives that transform progressively into, Series A, Series B, the fundraising, they raise capital. But at one moment, you need to find commercial solution. And for me, that's going to be when the selection is going to happen. If some new space transforms into a large top space company, it needs to have clients. It needs to have commercial applications. If it doesn't have, it needs to find money. For me, that's when the market will make its selection. There's no need for law to intervene, especially right now since everything is booming. So you don't want to kill the initiative right now. But when the issue might happen if space travel, especially all Virgin Galactic lookalike ventures are spreading all over, that might be a problem, especially with civil aviation regulation. That might become one. But I know that right now they are, all the civil aviation authority, they are trying to find solutions to accommodate, because we are and this very limit between national airspace and outer space. There is, as I said before, there is no formal legal definition of what is outer space. We don't really know when the outer space starts. So that's a question of compromise, and question of insurance also, and liability. Yeah. Please.
Do the space agreements have a power more than other treaties or agreements? Because we all know that the treatments are always or almost breached.
So what is the question? Excuse me again, I didn't hear you properly.
Do the space agreements have a power more than other agreements? Because we know that most of treaties or agreements are breached.
Okay, well, first of all, that's a very legal concept that's important for the understanding. Space law and international space law via treaty is considered as what we call lex specialis. That means this is a part of the international law that is really dedicated to the space industry. So that means that any rule that is in this type of lex specialis is above the general international law. But in any case, as you mentioned, if there is a breach on the treaty, that's the responsibility of the armed state to go to the international dispute resolution mechanism and say, oh, this country breached the treaty and I demand repair. But as I mentioned earlier, there is the concept also of sovereignty. So you can, in the worst case scenario, that can go to court, International Court of Justice, but if the sovereign state doesn't want to apply it, it's difficult to constrain the sovereign state to do whatever it or doesn't want. So that's the limit of international law. International law has always been existent because that's a relation between the states. Like, for instance, if you take the passport that you have, the passport that is given to you by the government is not your property, that's the property of your government. Because that's the government granting you the right to talk to go into the other government territory. So that's the limit of the exercise. International law is effective to regulate, but enforcement depends also on the willingness of the sovereign. Yeah.
Your answer to the question brought up another question to me. So the authority or governing authority that regulates this, is there a specific one? Like in aviation, you have IATA or EASA or ICAO. Is there anything like that for the space?
You mean in the international level?
Yes.
Long story short, no. Not yet. Probably not in so wait sometimes. International national agencies are talking to each other. NASA, ESA, CNES, JAXA, all these guys are talking to each other. But there is not like a unified international body that emits norms. That doesn't exist yet. Maybe it will exist one day, but for now it's remained a very national competence. Even like, for instance, if you take the EU, European Union, it's a very integrated international organization, but everything related to space is national-only competence. So that's why you have, even if you take European Space Agency, it's a space agency, but it's an international body. So it's still not under the flag of a sovereign state. So that's why you always have the flag of the member state, not only ESA. All right, I think everybody wants to have a coffee now because too much law. Huh? Well, thank you so much for attending this session. I hope it was an interest for you. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach me. And it was a pleasure and an honor to be here with you tonight. Thank you again so much for the warm welcome. Thank you so much. Très bien. Je sais pas comment je me rends ça.